like we've hit a lull and people waiting in the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Washington County Water Consortium, and also in partnership with the St. Croix virtual workshops on the water. We have some great presentations today by Angie and Matt Bauman with the DNR. Similar to last time, please keep yourself muted during the presentations. And we will have time for questions. And also, please feel free while the presenters are going to ask questions in the chat, and then we can visit them at the end of their presentations. As a quick reminder, we do have 2 more of these workshops coming up. So we have one on June 10th, which is in regards to landscaping and habitat, and then one on June 17th on the St. Croix Riverway. We've sent out some links for registering for these, but we'll send them out again after the meeting, so you have another chance to register. Does anyone else have any other announcements they would like to make? Okay, it doesn't seem that way, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then pass it over to Angie.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. I think that it sometimes works better during the presentations. I think most people have their videos turned off. It probably works better if the rest of you turn your videos off. Just sometimes when everybody is streaming at once, that can clog up the bandwidth and make it a little harder for the signal to come through. I am going to go ahead then and start the presentation, and I am starting with the who is in charge. Who is in charge in common scenarios? And Maureen will be in the background kind of keeping track of our chat questions as they're coming in and letting me know if there's questions along the way. But this is a basic overview when we're talking about protecting lakes and rivers, and especially on shoreline areas. Where do the different responsibilities fall in terms of the different entities at a federal, state, and local level? So, a little bit about myself. I think you all know me, but I coordinate the East Metro Water Resource Education Program. It's a 25-member partnership of local government in Washington County. And I do have my current contact information on here. We are recording the presentations today, and so they'll be posted on both the Washington Conservation District website and the Water Consortium website for you to be able to access afterwards. So don't worry if some of the information in here, if we go through it quickly, you can go back and access it on the slides later afterwards. So just to set the framework, in terms of why we are talking about who's in charge with water quality. Obviously in Minnesota, we're the land of 10,000 lakes. Water is a huge part of our culture, of who we are. And yet we also know that, oh dear. Okay. All right. We also know that a lot of sorry, I'm not sure what is going on. It keeps trying to the internet. Okay.
It worked for me.
Okay. Sorry, on my end, it kept hopping to the internet all of a sudden. I must have accidentally had a buried link in there. I was afraid we had a hacker for a moment. So even though we all care about our lakes and our rivers, it is still a fact that we have a lot of lakes, rivers, and streams in the state that are classified as impaired. The percentage for many years when I started this job, I always told people 40%, and with new testing happening around the state, that number has actually been bumped up to 56%. So We also know that this is part of a larger problem. It's not just the state of Minnesota. It's not just our local lakes. It's things that are happening in the river system. We know that we need to reduce phosphorus going to the St. Croix River by 27% actually. We know that what we do up here in Minnesota works its way down to the Gulf of Mexico and causes problems down there as well. So we have this whole structure that has been put into place to manage different aspects of water quality. And in an attempt to simplify this when explaining to master water stewards in the past, I had put together this really nice flow chart, which upon looking at it, I realized just demonstrates how incredibly complicated water management actually is. Just to take a little bit of a deeper dive into these layers, starting with the federal government, the foundation of most of what we do is in the Clean Water Act of 1972, which set a goal to restore and maintain the integrity of the nation's waters. Around the same time, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, which oversees the Clean Water Act and the Drinking Water Act. And then there's other federal agencies that have roles to play. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is primarily concerned with flood prevention, dams. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they administer the Endangered Species Act for freshwater and terrestrial species. The NRCS, which is a division of the Department of Ag that works directly with farmers and ranchers. And then there are also the sovereign tribes that are in Minnesota, the Anishinaabe and the Dakota tribes, which have their own natural resources management programs. So then if we kind of take the next step down, we get to a state level. And within the state, the different departments are under the purview of the Minnesota Governor's Office. So we have the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which is charged with implementing the Clean Water Act, overseeing the municipal separate stormwater system permit program, establishing water quality standards, and maintaining the list of what our impaired water bodies are. Then there's the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR. They manage public waters, they set the ordinary high water levels, are responsible for groundwater appropriations, shoreline and floodplain management, and AIS and fisheries. We've got the Board of Water and Soil Resources, BWSR. Most people call it BWSR, oversees the soil and water conservation programs done at the local level and the Wetland Conservation Act, and approves local water plans. We have the Department of Health that's primarily looking at drinking water quality and health-based standards for things like fish consumption. And then of course the Department of Agriculture is also working with farmers and regulates the use of pesticides and fertilizers. And then finally we get down to the local level, which is where a lot of the work is actually happening. The cities and towns are establishing local policies, ordinances, and zoning. The townships may do planning and zoning as well, and are managing stormwater through the MS4 programs. Outside the metro area, the counties are usually the ones that are the local water planners. There's a metropolitan council that operates within the 7 county metro areas, responsible for wastewater treatment, doing water monitoring on lakes and rivers, water supply planning, future growth planning. We have a unique unit of government in Minnesota, the Watershed Districts, which are kind of like a school district. I think a lot of you are very familiar with these already, but they don't necessarily exist in other states. And they're primarily charged with flood prevention and water quality protection. The watershed management organizations have similar roles, but instead of being an independent taxing district, they're formed through a joint powers agreement between the different cities that are in the areas. And then across the entire state of Minnesota, there's soil and water conservation districts that are working directly with landowners and providing support for voluntary conservation projects. So that's a little bit about, this whole network, but we're going to be focusing in the next couple of seminars mostly on shoreline management, and wanted to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Minnesota DNR has a shoreline management program. I've got the link to their website, and what they provide are statewide standards that local governments must adopt into their ordinances to provide for orderly development and protection of the shorelands. So this applies just to the inland lakes and rivers. It doesn't apply along the St. Croix Riverway. But the key distinction here is that the DNR does not enforce these rules. This is something that the local government adopt through your own ordinances and regulate and enforce through your own ordinance systems. And local government also can set up variance process for requests that don't meet those standards. So these Shoreland programs apply to all of the public water statewide that meet these following criteria. So in general, it's larger lakes and type 3, 4, and 5 wetlands, and a few lakes and wetlands that are assigned to specific shoreline classifications. Within the Shoreland district, there is a boundary which applies to the area that's 1,000 feet from the ordinary high water level for lakes and wetlands and 300 feet for rivers and streams, just to give you a visual of what that area looks like. And the reason that these standards exist is to help protect water quality. So they are generally, most important, the standards are for preserving water quality, lot size, structure, and septic setback standards, limits on how much impervious surface there can be, and some guidelines for shoreline vegetation management. And we have a lot of research that shows that as you move from an undeveloped lakeshore to a minimally developed lakeshore to a highly developed lakeshore, we see dramatic increases in the amount of runoff that happens, in the amount of phosphorus that is going into our lakes and rivers, and in the amount of sediment that's going into the lakes and rivers. And just another way of showing that graphically, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, under natural cover, only about 10% of the rain and melting snow is running off, and 50% of it is soaking into the ground, replenishing groundwater aquifers, or going through the shallow groundwater system into lakes and streams. And as you continue moving clockwise around the circle, you can see that with each layer of additional development, you have more runoff and less infiltration. So what this looks like in real life, in places you might be more familiar with, we have up in the upper left-hand corner, a completely natural system, moving to big marine lake area, maybe as a minimally developed system. You get down into Woodbury, we have a much more developed area. And then you can see some of our commercial districts. This example is from down in Apple Valley, but I could show you pictures from Woodbury that would look the same, that are highly impervious, where there's very little place for water to soak in, and the vast majority of the water is running off. And I always like to show this photo. 1 pound of phosphorus equals 500 pounds of algae, just to drive home the concept of how phosphorus relates to water quality in a very, very direct way. And lastly, just wanted to point out that in addition to all of the natural impacts of having reduced water quality, both for nature and for our own enjoyment of the water, we can also see that there is an impact on property values for shoreline landowners. When the water clarity and the water quality gets worse, the property value goes down by 22%. So within the St. Croix Riverway, it is a federally designated wild and scenic river, and therefore has additional regulations. But these are created and enforced at the local level, with the exception of National Park Service easements. And we're having a follow-up presentation on June 17th. And during that, Matt Bauman from Minnesota DNR and Kay Lutz from Wisconsin DNR are going to talk specifically about the riverway regulations in a lot more detail. Just to give you a visual description of what these standards look like. In a urban area, there is a 100-foot setback from the ordinary high water level for developed things like houses, garages, and a 40-foot setback from where the bluff line is. And in some cases with the St. Croix River, you might actually end up having multiple bluff lines like this figure is showing. DNR permits are only required for activities below the ordinary high water level. And so other things, this is a permit that they're applying at the local level. If somebody is doing something on their house up here, up above the ordinary high water level, they're applying for permits through the local entity, not through the DNR. The standards are a little bit different in rural areas. There's a little bit greater setback required in the rural areas. And there are a lot more details in terms of lot size, water frontage, structure height details related to how much can be developed. I did also mention that there's National Park Service easements, and these happen in the northern part of the river. So basically the high bridge just north of Stillwater, from there up is where the National Park Service boundary begins. And there's properties on both sides of the river that have National Park Service easements that protect those areas from being developed from any kind of vegetation trimming. Those are under management of the National Park Service. So then there's this, one, like I mentioned, additional layer that happens in Minnesota. We have watershed districts, and these were created by state law in 1955 and address water issues in a watershed scale rather than on a municipal or county boundary scale. So in many cases, the watershed district may have additional rules that are slightly different or above and beyond what a local entity has. For those of you who are in Washington County, you already know this, but we do have 8 different watershed management organizations in our county. And they issue permits for stormwater management, erosion control, lake, stream, and wetland buffers, shoreline and stream bank alterations, stream and lake crossings, and floodplain drainage alterations. Every watershed district has a slightly different set of rules, so it's really important to work with your watershed district if you know that you have landowners in your area that are developing, redeveloping, selling, to make sure they know who their watershed district, who their WMO is. But for example, this is coming from the Browns Creek Watershed District. Anytime somebody is subdividing 4 or more lots, or they're going to be adding 5,000 or more square feet of new impervious surface, then that's something that they should be working with the watershed district. This is even if they're outside the shoreland area. In terms of the erosion and sediment control, contacting the watershed district or WMO if it will be disturbing 5,000 or more square feet of soil or 50 cubic yards of material going in or out. There may be required buffers on many of the lakes, streams, and wetlands that are enforced through the watershed district. And if there are buffer requirements, then people are not allowed to mow or build structures or cut down trees within those buffer areas. And other kinds of things, shoreline and stream bank alterations may be regulated through the watershed district as well. Things like turning a natural shoreline, putting down riprap, or adding a retaining wall, creating a sand beach or a sand blanket. Water crossings also. This one I'm pretty sure it got grandfathered in, right? Floodplain or drainage alterations, if these would very often fall under the purview of the Wetland Conservation Act as well, but people should contact the watershed district or WMO if they are considering something like filling in a low spot or changing a drainage pattern, grading, drain tiles, culverts, things like that. How to find your watershed district WMO if you are outside of Washington County. The www.mnwatershed.org connects to all of the watershed districts and WMOs that are in Minnesota. Just wanted to mention too that the Washington Conservation District does not have any regulatory authority related to lakes and streams, but the Conservation District does do water quality monitoring on behalf of most of the watershed districts in our area. And so they are monitoring all sorts of parameters, water quality, flow, elevation, and looking at long-term trends. So I'm going to pause real quick before going into common scenarios and see if we have any questions that have popped up in the chat. Now, I was talking a little fast. I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for Matt to talk at the end as well.
So Angie, I have a question.
Yeah.
Tell me again, 1 pound of phosphorus equals how many pounds of algae?
500. Isn't that insane? That's based on research coming from the University of Minnesota that 1 pound of phosphorus is able to result in about 500 pounds of algae growth in a lake.
It blows my mind.
Yep, it is kind of crazy.
Okay. I let's see, there's something else. Oh, I have a question about the Federal Clean Water Act. I thought the current administration is trying to get rid of that. Where's that at? Do you know?
No idea.
19.
No idea. Yep.
Okay. I don't know who it's up to, if it's up to Congress or the president.
It would be, yes. It's, yeah, it would. It's something that was passed by Congress, you know, back in 1972, so it would take congressional action to change that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to run through a couple of quick scenarios that we often hear from shoreline landowners. And these may be, if you are working for a local unit of government, these may be the kinds of scenarios that come to you on a regular basis. So let's start with a scenario number one that may seem innocuous. Hi, sorry, I guess I got muted for a moment. Okay, so adding a new deck. This seems like a fairly innocuous situation. Does this have any relationship to shoreline standards? Is this something that a landowner would need to apply for a permit from somebody? Anybody? What do you think? How about
Yes,
we can use
definitely.
Let's use the chat feature, make this a little bit more interactive. I'm going to pop open. I'm going to pop this open. So if you can think of some kind of permit that somebody would need to apply for adding a new deck, type it into the chat box. Okay, I see Kristen saying yes. I see lots of quietness. Okay, so first of all, any kind of project like this, people should be contacting their city or county zoning administrator. Keep in mind that there are multiple permits that people need to apply for building kinds of projects. So a deck at minimum would need a building permit. It would need to meet minimum setback requirements if it's along the St. Croix Riverway or along a shoreline area. And there might be city, county, or watershed shoreline setbacks. And in addition, there might be buffer rules. So that's something to consider if a person would need to be removing trees or other vegetation to build the deck. That could impact where they build the deck, what side of the home they're allowed to build the deck on, how big the deck could be. Okay, this one might seem a little easier. Adding an addition to the house. Yes. Hopefully you can all tell that this one would be one that would need a lot of oversight. Looking at the building permit again, this is also going to have the same requirements related to setbacks, related to buffers. Within the St. Croix Riverway, for example, you cannot exceed the impervious surface percentage limits. And sometimes people might be required to include a rain garden or some other kind of feature to mitigate the increased runoff that the addition would create. All right, building a boathouse. Anybody know about building a boathouse? What do you think?
Don't you have to get permission?
Got to get permission. And in fact, building a boathouse, Minnesota and Wisconsin do not allow new boathouses to be built below the ordinary high water level. DNR permit is required for repair of existing boathouses. And the city county zoning administrator should be contacted if somebody is wanting to construct or reconstruct a boathouse above the ordinary high water level. What about, this is a really common one that we hear about, clearing trees to see the water better. And full disclosure, this is the backyard of one of the Watershed District administrators in our area, which I think is lovely, and I use it all the time as an example of how you can have a lake-friendly backyard that allows access to a lake while still having natural vegetation.
As long as the trees are within that 40-foot buffer, you can't do that. You have to do it beyond.
Yep, so in St. Croix Riverway, no vegetation removal or tree limb removal within the ordinary high water level and bluff setback zone. Within Minnesota Shoreland Management Districts, you may remove 10 to 20% of trees and shrubs without a DNR permit, but people should always be contacting their city and county zoning admin to determine if the property is within a special management area or if there's other rules like watershed buffer rules. All right. Creating a beach. This is another common one that we see happening on a lot of lakeshore properties. Did you know that new beaches or beaches may only be installed and repeated once at the same location? So if a person puts in a beach and there's flooding and the beach is washed away, they can put down a new beach again once. And after that, by law, they should not be putting down any additional sand blankets. And this rule is connected to the location, not to the landowner. So that doesn't mean that every time the home gets resold, the next person can put down a sand blanket. This means that once the sand blanket has washed away twice at the same location, it's not a good place to be putting sand down, and we don't want people to keep continuing to do that. The beach guidelines, no more than 6 inches thick, 50 feet wide along the shore, or 1/2 the width of the lot. And DNR permit would be required, as well as working with the local entities. Creating a fire ring. This is another one that sounds like it should be innocent, like it's just a fire ring if you have the kind of fire ring that I have. But a lot of times people's fire rings really end up creating a lot of impervious surface. And so in those cases, it would fall under, it would fall under the same rules in terms of creating new impervious surface or development. And I think this might be my last example, stairs, lifts, and docks. So stairs, lifts, and docks should not obstruct navigation or create a safety hazard, harm fish and wildlife habitat. They must allow water to flow freely beneath. They cannot be a boathouse or human habitation masquerading as a dock. Sometimes, people try to get clever in getting around the rules, build a dock and put a big house on top of it and, be able to get a new boathouse built in that way. And there are some circumstances in which a DNR permit would be required if it's in a posted fish spawning area that's wider than 8 feet if you're removing aquatic vegetation. In all of these cases, it's really the best thing to do is to check with the city, county on local zoning regulations and be sure that landowners are meeting any of the rules that might be in existence.
Angie, is there a limit to how far the dock can extend?
This is a great question for Matt Bauman to answer when he gets on as the next presenter, because I'm sure there is, and I'm sure that I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to be turning things over to Matt in a moment with the Minnesota DNR, and just wanted to pause again and see if there are any additional questions that might have come through before I turn things over to him. Okay, I'm just scrolling back here through some of the things that came in through the chat. Okay. So this was kind of an intro teaser. Like I said, we'll have these slides posted and we'll send out the email with the links afterwards so that you can have copies of the content. And I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Matt now to talk a little bit more in depth and detail.
Thank you, Angie. That was very informative. I'll start by answering the question, which was docks into public waters, and the limit is no more than that is what's required to gain access with your boat, and you know, that's an inexact science, and there's been people that have flirted with those limits, but as I believe, that's the way it's written in rule. And if I'm wrong, there's, I think, at least 2 area hydrologists on this call that can chime in and tell me I'm wrong.
Thanks, Matt.
So I believe you all see my screen now, and I'm Matt Bauman. I'm with the DNR. I work out of central office and support our area hydrologists and local communities on the administration of their various land use programs that they administer. And I used to work as a zoning administrator myself, and this presentation is primarily geared towards others that are tasked with enforcing vegetation and land alteration standards in their nearshore areas. So most any zoning administrator out there would acknowledge that these are very hard standards to enforce. There's a lot of work that goes on without any kind of permit that's issued that we never find out about unless there's a complaint. And violations require a lot more staff time than most communities are willing or able to dedicate. And I only have 20 minutes for this presentation, so I'm going to have to speak broadly to these standards. And you know, if you have questions as you go along, I encourage you to add them to the chat box, and I believe Maureen will be monitoring that, and I can address them as they come, or if there's anything that's more pressing, just feel free to cut in. So the ordinance standards on a local community's books are highly variable by community and what district the property's in. And like Angie said, we have state rules, but they're all administered at the local level. So there's unique vegetation and land alteration standards for shoreland areas, for our Mississippi River corridor critical area, which follows the corridor within the 7-county metro area. Each of the 6 wild and scenic river districts around the state have unique vegetation and land alteration standards, as well as those standards in the Lower St. Croix Riverway district. They're all different, you know, so there's nuances to every single one. And additionally, if the site's in the floodplain, there's additional provisions guiding earth moving activities as well. So each community regulating these programs may have regulations that exceed those in rule, so it's important to recognize the standards that apply to any given property are determined by the local community ordinance. So I'll start by speaking about the importance of keeping our nearshore areas natural, and then focus on kind of the regulatory standards in shoreland ordinances. And the emphasis being on shorelands, since those cover the most significant area throughout the state. And lately, we've been promoting the establishment and maintenance of natural shorelines really wherever possible. It's a challenge, but it's a fight worth fighting. And the shoreline rules really allow clearing to accommodate a view, for access, for a beach, and there's ways to do it in an environmentally friendly manner. Now, I took this picture just this last weekend, but I thought Angie's picture was actually a better representative example, but I thought that this picture provided a good example of a property that's very residential in character, yet protects that nearshore area in a reasonable manner. So I mean, these protections are for erosion protection from waves, from fluctuating water, steep slopes. It provides habitat for some really important critters, and protects our scenic value of our lakes. And while water quality is certainly a very important component, it's actually not the main driver for these protections. Now, there's plenty of other contributing factors that contribute to water quality within a watershed. So who recognizes this picture? It's kind of unfortunate, but all too many shoreline owners see this as their ideal. There's a lot of property owners who want to bring their suburban landscape.
The masters.
Yeah, this is the 12th, I believe. You know, and folks want to bring their suburban landscape, which is the area that they know best, to their lakeshore home.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big golfer too, and I recognize how much of a gem Augusta is. But from an environmental perspective, it's wrong on many, many levels. So not only from an environmental perspective, but from a functional perspective too. Grass has an incredibly short root system, and under ideal conditions, you can potentially maintain a shoreline like that. But we have waves, we have fluctuating water levels. You know, we have huge cigar boats that are running up and down the shore, and wakeboard boats are ever more popular. We have freezing and thawing cycles, bringing ice ridges to shore. So we end up with fixes that looks like the ones on the right here. You can see the sandbags that they put along shore, and the rope to keep the geese out. And I mean, as probably everybody on this call knows, many property owners can get pretty obsessive fighting weeds, you know, maintaining their beach areas or chasing off geese, instead of just accepting the fact that nature kind of wants to maintain a balance and is really pretty good at doing so.
Matt, is it illegal to use fertilizer and chemicals?
I believe Minnesota has a phosphorus a phosphorus ban, or prohibits phosphorus in nearshore areas, but I couldn't tell you the details of that.
And another question, this is confusing to me. So there's all these different rules and they vary by community. And did you say it's the LGU that is supposed to enforce them?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
And the DNR doesn't have permitting authority for anything above the ordinary high water level. We have state rules, and local governments are tasked with enforcing those rules, but it's up to the local community to enforce its own ordinance. And it's also up to the residents to hold their community accountable. So if there's decisions being made locally, you know, as a resident, as a voter, as an attendee to public meetings, everybody's responsible for holding their community accountable.
Doesn't the Park Service play a role?
The Park Service administers easements, and they're certainly a public face. But below Taylor's Falls, it's basically completely up to the local governments to enforce their ordinance. And that's speaking in the Lower St. Croix specifically.
Thank you. So,
you know, for the very active nearshore property owner, we get fixes like this one here. And I don't, you know, by looking at it, I don't really know if it's a fix or whether it's just ornamental. The rock seems a little small to meet the dimensions of riprap. And I mean, I can't imagine how many loads of rock it took to complete this project. Or this one, you know, I think both of these projects would have been incredibly costly. And under the shoreland rules, activities in the nearshore area, they don't require a permit from the local government unless you're moving a lot of material. And I believe Angie's Watershed District, I think their permitting threshold based on her presentation before is actually lower than the Shoreland program. So a lot of communities seem to overlook the permit requirements for riprap. And there's certain cases where a riprap project that is exempt from a DNR permit. We have a handout to explain the riprap provisions and when a permit is required. However, both of these projects in these pictures here should have required a DNR permit. And considering these probably didn't meet the definition of RIPRAP, the DNR likely wouldn't have ever issued a permit.
Mhm.
So I can guess that these were probably carried out without a permit and are violations, but that's just an assumption. You know, and we mentioned our goose problem. It's worth noting that neither of these fixes solve their goose problem. And our wildlife folks have documented the geese actually, they don't like to go near brushy areas, which are the areas where predators could potentially be hiding out in ambush. You know, pay attention to where you see geese on the shoreline. You know, and that's why we see golf courses and our turf grass shorelines is just a goose magnet.
This is
So-
Kristen with Carnelian Marine Watershed District. We're seeing more and more shorelines that are like the ones you showed, and we're having people redo them.
Good. And a local community should, and I'll be getting into that, should be looking for opportunities for restoration. And there are certain opportunities, violations being the obvious one. But I'll be getting into that later in the presentation.
Okay.
So building off of our geese problem, this is an ad from our fishing regulations book, and this is a DNR created product, and we had a lot of meetings about this ad specifically. But anyway, what I'm getting at is we ultimately need buy-in from our shoreline property owners, and we struggle with how to sell a property owner on the importance of shoreline vegetation. So, you know, I don't know who we're represented by today in the audience, but if you're on a planning commission, you may be thinking about how you can sell it to the other appointed officials you work with, or the zoning administrator, or your neighbors. You know, they need to see the value in shoreline vegetation. So we recognize that not all property owners are motivated to provide habitat or reduce erosion, or even preserve the scenic character of a lakeshore. There's a ton of people out there that see a huge mansion on the water and see it as an improvement over what was there naturally. So anyway, we put this ad in this year's fishing regulations book, and that speaks to that property owner that just simply despises geese. And if we're being realistic, that's basically every property owner out there. There just seems to be a general overall disdain for geese. So, yeah. I mean, I know this ad is probably a little hokey, but I mean, maybe it'll get some people's attention. Pictures like these ones tend to make their way into my inbox every so often. But you know, one overall consistency that you see is the lack of any kind of deep-rooted or woody vegetation. You know, the shoreline and the riverway programs, they both have bluff protection standards that are meant to protect structures and prevent erosion and preserve the character of the shoreline. And our server's full of like bad stuff, but you know, we always forget to take a picture of the good stuff when we see it, and it's really the good stuff that motivates people. And if we're going to promote good stewardship, we got to share success stories. So this is an excellent before and after of a shoreline restoration. This property owner worked through Stearns County SWCD, and I think it involved a cost share. But overall, it was probably cheaper than any of those riprap or boulder projects that I shared a few slides back. So digging into the specifics of the standards themselves, the shoreline program is nowhere near as strict about vegetation removal as those areas along the St. Croix. I know we probably have good representation from communities along the riverway. But the standards in the shoreline program specifically leave some to be desired. The program, the rules at least, they prohibit intensive vegetation removal, but it doesn't define it in the rules and most ordinances, or really offer any kind of specifics about what intensive vegetation removal is. So Angie noted, you know, 20% of your shoreline might be reasonable, and a lot of communities probably enforce a standard similar to that. And I think it can even be argued that that might have been the intent in the rules, but actually the rules are quite vague on this. And additionally, at least in the shoreline program, vegetation removal doesn't require a permit at all. It doesn't mean that those standards don't need to be met, but there's, you know, it's just kind of not watertight. There's plenty of opportunities for a community to do more and to make their ordinance a little bit more watertight. And those are two areas to start. You can simply require a permit for removal activities, or you can come up with some clear ordinance language. Now, a lot of communities have defined what intensive vegetation removal is, and then limit those removals for access or for views to maybe a set percentage of the lot width, or like some kind of maximum lateral distance along shore. And I mean, if a community is enforcing just the bare minimum standards, there are lots of opportunities to require vegetation restoration whenever the project would, one, whether it would trigger a variance. You can apply conditions that way, which would include restorations. When it triggers a conditional use permit, and whether the project involves any kind of permit for land alterations as well. Now, each of these chances are for a local government to apply mitigating conditions that must be somewhat related and proportional, those are legal terms, to the activities. And really, communities should be very proactive in taking advantage of these types of applications and, you know, getting something good out of it. So with the high water issues we've been seeing around the state, local governments are getting a lot of applications for shoreline, you know, fixes or restorations. And in most cases, it's just simply a loss to real estate or shoreline, like this one. Well, this one is probably a little bit more extreme than that. You know, like here's an example of a stretch of non-conforming houses that are built very close to the water with very little vegetation. And in a lot of our landlocked lakes around the state, this has been a common story. Water levels have been coming up, threatening their structure. And there have been many applications to bring in fill as a line of defense against high water, and then armoring that, you know, that water side of the fill with riprap. And if earth moving activities occur above or below the ordinary high water level, you're dealing with a permit from the local government as well as a permit from the DNR. And then if you're on the St. Croix, you're also needing a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. Shoreline rules basically allow unlimited placement to dirt, but it requires a permit, and you know, if it's above a certain threshold. However, you know, it may allow the placement to dirt, but it still prohibits intensive vegetation removal. So it's pretty hard to carry out a project like this without killing all the vegetation. So whether it's treated as intensive vegetation removal or not, a zoning administrator, they can and they should be applying conditions to these types of land alterations permits. And that could include revegetating the shoreline with dense vegetation, you know, with woody vegetation, both now and later when the waters recede. There's plenty of vegetation types that can handle flooding. And, you know, I'd encourage everybody to take a hard look at their ordinance language. And if there's activities that allow for the application of conditions to think about how a permit application is an opportunity to improve what's there. Now, community's floodplain ordinance regulates land disturbances in a couple of ways. Where the site is mapped as floodway, which is typically those near shore areas where we got fast moving water or basically anything below the ordinary height would be considered floodway. It prohibits fill and subjects any kind of earth moving activities to an engineering analysis to verify that those activities wouldn't cause a rise during a 100-year event. So this would also apply to RIPRAP projects. That's our most common land alteration near shore. So all floodplain districts, including X zones, which are actually areas outside of a 100-year floodplain boundary, that's still a flood zone, require the zoning administrator to consider potential impacts to neighboring properties. So anytime you're moving dirt, you're changing the way the water moves off the land. And when processing a permit, it's the local zoning administrator's responsibility to look at how these activities will affect overland flows. And in this case, which, I mean, granted, it's a very extreme example, large scale filling like this will protect structures from rising waters on the lake, but you're also basically creating your damming waters, holding in flows coming off the land, which will pull them up. Ordinance standards in the riverway will be the focus of my presentation on the 17th, which I'd encourage anybody attending on the 17th to attend that one. There I'll get in a little bit more in depth and promote a few higher standards for communities. But what I will note is that the standards for removal are much more strict. Of the provisions I'm noting here, there's nothing that allows clearing to accommodate a view or a yard, and that's because it's prohibited. But like the Shoreline program, the riverway rules, I mean, there's plenty of weaknesses too, and many folks may realize that these protections leave some to be desired at the same time. So in the near future, we're hoping to ramp up our efforts to promote higher standards that communities can incorporate into their ordinance, and you know, just administrative best practices. So these higher standards, I mean, they're basically standards that are more strict than rule. You know, they're important to think about. Vegetation standards, I mean, they're hard enough to enforce, but I mean, they're just easier when your ordinance is written rock solid. So it's important to think critically about your ordinance and how it regulates these activities. You know, you got to think about what situations when restoration would be appropriate. We had high water basically throughout the entire state, and there's going to be a whole lot of dead trees in floodplain areas. And as a result of all that vegetation that we're going to lose, there's going to be a lot more erosion to come. So we're likely to see a lot more permits processed for our near shore activities, and that's something that a zoning administrator is probably very well aware of. And you know, so just be aware what common issues you're seeing, what opportunities do you have to apply these mitigating conditions. If you're a zoning administrator and you get to the point of walking an applicant through a restoration project, we'd suggest being very clear on specifics for what you want to see in that restoration, and consider how you're going to prevent the next property owner from ripping it all out. There's tools like deed restrictions that a community can apply to a restoration, restrictive covenants, permanent easements, and recording them with the county. So there's also monitoring. Monitoring is a part of vegetation removal, and it should be a responsibility of zoning administrators, but truthfully, very few zoning administrators actively monitor vegetation removal. Now, Washington County I searched around on their county mapper, and they have some amazing aerial imagery where you can see details, specific trees, and I think the images are from 2009, I believe, and I mean that's one way to monitor removal activities. And if you're a smaller community, which most in the Riverway are, I mean, a more straightforward method, it wouldn't be that hard to get in a boat and take some pictures of your shoreline. I guess either way, it helps to have some kind of a documented baseline to prove that a violation has taken place when it comes up, because they're just very difficult to enforce. And just real quick, one more thing about higher standards. Where at the DNR, we're all in a higher standards. We're ramping up our efforts on it. This web page here is one that we recently rolled out, which basically offers kind of a grab bag of different examples of higher standards that a community consider. These are real ordinance examples from around the state that have actually been adopted and implemented. They're grouped by category. We can provide a citation for where that provision is contained in that community's ordinance, and we've been granted permission by each community to share these examples. We have these grouped by 10 categories, and two of those, one's higher standards related to vegetation removal, and another category we have on this page highlights higher standards as it relates to land alterations. The one on your right are the examples related to vegetation standards. So it's important to note that this webpage highlights examples really appropriate for a shoreland ordinance, but the concepts shared here can be applied to other overlay districts as well. And you know, in the near future, we're hoping to roll out recommendations for beefing up ordinances specific to the Lower St. Croix Riverway, as well as local floodplain ordinances too. And just real quickly on restoration, I think this is my last slide. It's important for motivated residents to know how they can get resources for installing a successful restoration project. You know, I guess it goes beyond just hiring the guy that mows your yard, but it's important to take advantage of the resources available through your soil and water conservation district, your watershed district, your watershed management organization. The DNR state nursery is a great place to get some very cheap bare root plants. You can get just about any kind of native woody plant out there for like 50 cents or $1 a plug, and they got various mixes for pulling in birds, pulling in turkeys or other wildlife, and just adding general diversity. But it's a cheap way to vegetate a huge shoreline. And this Bowser page is actually an excellent page, which has some tremendous resources. More detail than I even know how to summarize. So I think that's all I got. I guess I hope this information I've shared has been helpful, and you know, if nothing else, I hope I've inspired you to look into other tools available.
Matt, there seems to be a number of questions about enforcement in the chat. So people are wondering, first of all, if an activity is clearly in violation, then what happens? And also, if there are violations happening and the local government isn't enforcing them, is there any recourse?
Well, every ordinance should have a violation section. So it's just up to the local zoning administrator to enforce that violation section. And enforcement is a tough thing because there's a huge amount of variability in in what's enforced and what's not. There's some communities that have very active enforcement, and then there's other communities that don't. And if something isn't being enforced, and that violation provision is very clear as written in their ordinance, then a local citizen can bring it to the attention of their community through a public meeting, or simply call their zoning administrator too. I can speak from personal experience that zoning administrators respond to constant badgering.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt and Angie. That was amazing. It seems like, does anyone have any more questions that they didn't have a chance to ask? Okay, it doesn't seem that way.
Okay.
So great. So thank you all so much for attending this water consortium. I know this one was a little shorter, but that's not a bad thing necessarily. So
it's a beautiful day, so you should definitely get outside and enjoy it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And keep your eyes on your emails for the next in the series of workshops that are coming out next week and the following. There'll be really good follow-ups to the one we just had here. So thank you. And we will be posting this like Angie had said, so don't worry. Okay,
right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Maureen. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.